Let's see. So next, we're going to have a little bit of a techie part with Tom Spies, Landscape 101. Just a reminder, I would have liked to have made the whole day on Landscape 101, but the planning team wouldn't let me. Um, so we're going to go over some things quickly, like FRV, NRV, HRV, FRCC, all of the other acronyms out there that are starting to become quite the what's the cereal with all the letters in it? Quite the alphabet soup. Which one are you, Tom?
Spies.
He's Spies. He's the Spies. Yeah, it was a very good intelligence test there for me. Okay. So please help me welcome Tom Spies. He's a forest researcher with the PNW Research Station right here in Corvallis. So thank you, Tom. All yours.
Thanks, Cheryl. Cheryl wanted me to kind of give a little bit of a Landscape 101, and as I began to think about landscape management and landscape ecology over the last 20 or 30 years, I began to think, well, how much have we've learned a lot in the landscape ecology front from a discipline that began in the early 80s to where we are now, and some of it has been sort of pulled into management and some of it hasn't. And so I woke up this morning feeling like the glass was a little bit on the half-empty side, but you could easily say that it's half full when it comes to applying landscape ecology in management. So what I thought I'd do is cover just sort of real basics, kind of remind us what landscapes are, why they're important, and then talk about some of the management applications and challenges. The whole social dimension is a huge part, and I echo John's comments. And then talk about maybe some opportunities to kind of move landscape ecology further, given that we think that's a good idea. So what are landscapes? Well, of course, they're spatially heterogeneous, such as this picture from the Biscuit Fire illustrates. They're fairly large, usually, although technically speaking, a landscape could be at any size. There's human influences, and they're species and process dependent. We can look at landscapes as more or less at the stand level, such as this picture of eucalyptus from Australia, and the spatial pattern there could be a landscape to a bird or a snake. The landscape can have a strong human imprint on it. It's certainly not just a natural pattern. In most of our landscapes these days, in fact, it's very hard to go very far without seeing the imprint of human activity. And so it used to be possible for ecologists to go out and find that one plot or that one little watershed where, quote, there was no human influence, but that's increasingly hard to do. And if you zoom up to landscape scales, it's almost impossible to find that landscape, particularly if you bring climate change into this picture. Humans are there in various ways, both subtle and not so subtle. And then when it comes to what is a landscape and how you define the boundaries of a landscape, that's often very process dependent. The landscape of a goshawk is completely different than the landscape of a beetle. And of course, this is a real challenge for managers because you can't manage, at least I don't think most of you can manage individually for all 858 species that occur in your particular area. So how do you integrate landscape perspectives from organisms and processes that really span a huge range of their own landscapes? A major challenge. Why do we even worry about landscapes? They're kind of cool patterns. But if we think of things at the patch level, at the stand level where management typically operated on through much of the 20th century, what you see there in terms of ecosystem processes is a function of the context of that management unit. And depending on the process that you're looking at, that influence can be strong or weak. So if we're talking about wildlife, the whole concept of sources and sinks in the landscape is critical to how you think about wildlife in a landscape context. The spotted owl is maybe the prime example in the Pacific Northwest, where the presence of an owl in a particular place may just be a function of what that surrounding landscape is and where the source populations are, such that you could find areas that are called sinks, that basically some places where people say owls go to die, or basically are either habitats that are not high quality enough or not large enough to really support the organism, and it's only there because it's subsidized by surrounding landscape conditions or the source patches. So knowing this source sink pattern is really important to understanding how to deal with wildlife issues. And in most cases, this pattern of sources and sinks is totally invisible to us. We don't know that for most species, except for maybe one or two, where we've done a lot of great research. Fire is another prime example of flows in a landscape where, depending on where you are, the fire may have a probability of getting there or not. This is some work that Alan Ager did. The line in the diagram at the right, I think here, you basically ignited lots of fires in a simulation model and burned them across the Deschutes to the east here. And you found that basically fire flowed in different ways. Lakes operated as natural fire breaks. And the time it took to get to different parts out here was a function of the intervening heterogeneity. So these are long times for the fire to get there, largely because of this barrier here. But this is a critical part of how to think about landscapes from a fire perspective. If we think about climate change, work we've done at the Andrews illustrates that cold air drainages in mountain systems move in different ways. And we often find that from looking at climate data that areas that might heat up at lower elevation may be buffered by the fact that cold air drains into these cold air pockets from higher elevations. And so expecting to see climate effects from warming in different elevations may be confounded or controlled by the topography that you're in. Another flow process is debris flow probability delivery. This is work that Gordy Reeves and Lee Benda have done, particularly in the Oregon Coast Range, and work with NetMap that illustrate that basically not all streams are the same, and some deliver debris flows to fish-bearing streams and others do not. And knowing which streams are which is critical to implementing landscape-type management practices from a standpoint of riparian and aquatic protection. So why landscapes is the answer basically because where you are in the landscape, the context really matters because things move. And often these movement patterns are invisible to us. And so a lot of the analytical work is trying to illustrate what those flow patterns are. I think, as John alluded, I think we've really excelled very well at landscape planning and identifying variability in the landscape, at drawing lines on a landscape for different allocations. From the early forest plan allocations that you can see on the left, that's a very rich landscape on the Deschutes that illustrates very different sort of capacities, both sociological and ecological, for what the landscape might be. We then overlaid the Northwest Forest Plan allocations on top of that, and that basically illustrated another way of thinking. A lot of that Northwest Forest Plan allocation was based on principles related to owl demographics and owl source sink kinds of considerations, but there were other factors as well. So we've done very well, I think, at sort of being able to draw lines, to identify different zones or allocations on our maps. But I would argue that was the easy part. And there are some really major challenges in sort of going beyond creating maps and zoning the landscape up. And that's basically to deal with dynamics, to deal with reference conditions, to deal with multi-ownership landscapes, and to deal with uncertainty and the need for flexibility when in managing landscapes. These are the next mountains to climb, and some of them are pretty tall. So let's talk about dynamics for a minute. Cheryl mentioned HRV, word of historic range of variability. We know that, as John showed, these landscapes aren't static, they change over time. Some work we did in the Oregon Coast Range basically illustrates the shifting mosaic as a result of wildfire. In this case, we've simulated, based on fire history work, how the mosaic of the Coast Range changes over 3 centuries. This, of course, is not the actual history, but we think it illustrates what a kind of history could have been for this area. And you see a shifting mosaic of older and younger forests over time. You see that it was dominated by a sort of a background mosaic of older forest. And so this gives us a sense of, okay, there's this dynamics that's out there, there's this range of variability, And management, of course, can't hope to duplicate this, but if we're trying to maintain diversity in these landscapes, knowledge of this diversity is pretty important. And we can take this and bring it into something called the historic range of variability, which is this notion that landscapes had a sort of a range that they operated under the past. For example, the Coast Range might have had 10 to 25% early seral, depending on what time period you looked at, or old growth. And this is then a potential way to sort of set up some goals, if you will, for managing for ecological diversity in the landscape by using our knowledge of the disturbance regimes. Of course, this is not so easily done. And it's a big question of, can we actually go back, or how far can we go back to recreate the historic range of variability for any one area? If we look at the Oregon Coast Range, for the case of forests that are 200 to 450 years old, this is where we are now in a space where we're talking about the area and aggregation, so a landscape metric where we go from sort of pretty isolated, fragmented, to fairly dominated by older forest. And then a landscape where the patches are pretty simple, pretty circular or square in the case of forest management, up to landscapes where the patches are much more complex, maybe created by fire. So this is where we are now. What if we wanted to go back there? What would it take? Well, we think, based on some simulation modeling, that in 100 years, our current policies would get us that far. Well, 100 years is, from our standpoint, that's a hell of a long time. From a forest standpoint, that's not very long. But what if we did this little thought experiment? What if we actually sort of got all the people out of there and returned the landscape to the wildfire regime that it had in the past? How long would it take? Well, we figured it would take about 400 years to get back to that particular condition, and we'd have to wander around and in this landscape space before we got back to what we thought was the historical range of variability. So it's difficult to go back. I don't think we can actually go back. But historic range of variability still is out there and still has some value. Another challenge to HRV is climate change. Think about the range of Alaska yellow cedar and what we know is going to happen in our Cascade Mountains as these mountains warm up and mortality increases for species living at higher elevations, or insects or other diseases occur. It's quite likely that this current pattern will shrink back and move north. So how to fold that into historic range of variability? Douglas fir, come on, Douglas fir is the species for the Northwest. How can we even talk about Douglas fir being at risk? Well, some of these darn climate modelers suggest that Douglas fir might actually be at risk in some areas. And so how does this fit into HRV? So there are some challenges to HRV, using it as a goal, I think, for future management. So here's how I'm thinking about HRV these days. I think of it really more as a waypoint than an endpoint. It's a way to navigate to where we want to be in the future, but it's not the actual point that you want to get to. And there are other waypoints out there, such as future range of variability. What the heck is that? I'll tell you in a second. And social acceptability, as John mentioned. That we can't just use the historical range of variability of the past as a guide. And in fact, this reminds me of one of the only times in the Forest Service that I think I may have told some people that where I've been rewarded and reprimanded for doing the same thing. Back in one of the earlier incarnations of the planning rule, a group of scientists at P&W were asked to come up with a metric to kind of counteract the species viability clauses of the planning rule. And so we sat around, Gordy Reeves was involved, Marty Raphael, we sat around for a few weeks and we came up with the idea, well, let's use historic range of variability as the guide and say that the responsible official must manage to keep the landscape within the historic range of variability for that area. And so we sent that up to the Washington office, and that was our contribution to the planning rule. And we got, of course, the feedback was quite interesting. We got a lot of feedback, not all of it very good. And, but Jim Lyons, who was the undersecretary at the time, liked what we did. My station director, Tom Mills, who was there at the time, hated what we did. So he called us up to Portland, reprimanded us for trying to propose to use HRV as the guide for forest management. And Jim Lyons gave us an award for doing the same thing. So obviously, these issues are controversial. So future range of variability, if the past is not so good as a goal, what about the future? We know climate's going to change. This is a relatively new concept. It's not been tried out, but it has some sort of intuitive appeal in that we know that there's going to be some climate dynamics. There's going to be disturbance regime changes as a result, not only of climate, but the landscape is no longer the same. The species mix is not there, the ownership patterns are different, and so that's going to constrain what you might actually be able to do in the landscape, and then there's this whole social acceptability. So future range of variability is sort of a concept that's out there. It's got some potential. I think we'll hear later today from the Wenatchee about how they're attempting to fold that into their planning. But it's sort of it's a rail. If we've got one hand on the past and we're reaching to the future, it's another way to sort of set some waypoints for navigating management of the forested landscape. What about restoration? Restoration is out there, so it's the big goal of the federal managers. But of course, with restoration, there's some implications there, some limitations on how we think about it. Resilience is often talked about more. And so resilience is maybe sort of the new word in addition to FRV. And some evolving scientific perspectives on that. One way to think about resilience is engineering resilience, where you had some particular metric that bounced around and then it went out of whack, and then we were trying to recover it to some quasi-stable state. That was a fairly narrow kind of a view of what resilience is. Ecological resilience, as we moved to HRV, was thinking of systems that are more dynamic, and we're really trying to move back to some historical variability under some relatively dynamic, but still nevertheless bounded kinds of conditions. More increasingly, we're talking about socio-ecological resilience, where it's not only sort of this ecological dynamic, but the ecological dynamic is now subject to climate change, so the whole the bounded region in which it moves may change in the future. And then social acceptability comes in, or social dimensions come in. And a great example of this, I think, is on the east side. There would be no way that you could really restore the forests of the east side without a contribution from the wood industry and the capacity to do woodwork and to deal with the material that's out there. So it's a joint effort. Talk about multi-ownership landscapes for a few seconds. This is work that Norm and I did in the Oregon Coast Range, where we recognized that coming out of the Northwest Forest Plan, that it wasn't just the federal land story, that from a biodiversity standpoint, the whole landscape mattered. Each of the different owners had a different goal for those landscapes. And of course, those different goals then add up to a condition that supports biodiversity in different ways. And so if we look at the current condition, or as of the mid-90s, of some key elements of biodiversity, we find that there's relatively little habitat for the owl, the bluebird, trout, and coho salmon. There's more habitat for the red tree vole or the olive-sided flycatcher across the whole landscape, across the whole coast range. But then if we ask, how is this piece of owl habitat distributed, or how is this place of great salmon habitat distributed, and we find that it's quite a different story when it comes to the ownership pattern. Spotted owls are pretty much a federal land story. That's where most of the spotted owl habitat is. Coho salmon, on the other hand, is lower in the watershed. It's mainly industrial land or private land. Relatively little of the public land controls the coho habitat. And yet a lot of the push for regulation and management issues on the federal land have to do with pushing for at least some of the fish species for which the best habitat is not actually on federal land. So knowledge of this distribution across ownerships is critical in sort of setting landscape expectations and goals. We then sort of projected the landscape future under the recently enacted Northwest Forest Plan. We went from a landscape that looks like this in terms of the distribution of older forest, where a lot of it is sort of fragmented and broken up, but concentrated on Siuslaw land and not much in other parts of the Coast Range. As we moved 50 years into the future, and then eventually 100 years into the future, we see a real diverging of the landscape as the old growth policies take place on the federal land, and the private lands pretty much are cycling on industrial forest rotations of 40 to 50 years. So what would be the outcome then of this sort of mix and change in habitat over time? Well, it's so the old winners and losers story. If we're talking about changes in this landscape, we projected great increases in the amount of owl habitat, marbled mural habitat, low mobility lichen, so great increases here. But on the other hand, decreases when it comes to hardwoods and diverse early successional, largely because the federals are managing for old growth. The private industrial lands are managing to get conifers in and packing in a well-stocked conifer stand. So nobody's really sort of looking out for that messier early successional stage. And so that might have some consequences. We did some scenario analysis where we looked at sort of what managers are doing now, increasing the retention of older trees in units on private lands, and then what would happen if we didn't thin the public lands where we're going into plantations. And we looked at a number of species, but these sort of illustrate some of the differences. We didn't see for any of those scenarios much difference in spotted owl. Spotted owl habitat went up under all of them. Western bluebird, on the other hand, really popped up when you leave some trees and habitat conditions in the open areas where bluebirds like to nest and forage. Olive-sided flycatcher seemed to differentiate all of them. If you didn't thin the federal lands, if you didn't sort of open up those plantations, that created some dense conditions that actually resulted in the lowest amounts of flycatcher habitat. But if we left some perch trees and diversity in those open areas, the amount of habitat went up. So there are consequences for different species of the different actions, and there are consequences for the fact that these land ownership patterns are not necessarily coordinated over time. So applications of landscape ecology and forest management, what has worked? I think spatial pattern through allocation and zoning has worked really well. We've developed some great tools to sort of evaluate pattern and what conditions might look like. In some cases, we've recognized processes. In the case of the spotted owl, a lot of the Northwest Forest Plan was based on spacing and amount of habitat areas that the owl needed. But areas that I don't think have worked well yet at all are implementing a more dynamic spaced approach, revising the allocations based on new knowledge. Once those lines are on the map, ooh boy, changing them is really tough. Working across boundaries, also really tough. And adaptive management, we talk about it a lot. In fact, I'm almost embarrassed to mention it because I seem to mention it at the end of every talk for the last 20 years. But it is still important, and we still must keep trying. So changing landscape management plans is scary. We attempted to do this in the Blue River study at the Andrews, where this is the Northwest Forest Plan. We wanted to change the allocations based on disturbance regimes. Not everyone really thought that was such a good idea, and I think the reaction to some of the critical habitat for the spotted owl or some of the proposals for the east side illustrate that once these lines are on maps, changing them at this really broad scale is not an easy thing to do. So there are many barriers to implementing landscape concepts in terms of creating more flexibility, and most of them have to do with human attitudes and social systems. And this, I think, is where progress needs to be made if we really want to implement landscape concepts in their fullest extent in the future. Uncertainty, this is the big bugaboo. This is a great way to stop a conversation in a group of managers or public. Of course, we always deal with uncertainty, but uncertainty can be used to either stop progress because we don't know enough to try different things. But in the context of the rapidly changing environment that we're in, the fact that the more we know, in some cases, the more we don't know about how these systems might react, we need to really embrace uncertainty as a framework for learning and moving forward. We think that scenario planning is a great way. We used to talk about models as predictors. I don't try to use not the P word anymore. We might use projections or possible outcomes. And scenario planning is a way, perhaps, to do that. It recognizes that we don't maybe know what the future might be, but it could be a way of interacting with people around the notion of actually trying some different things out at a landscape scale. And so finally, I think we'll hear today there's lots of new technologies and ways to visualize landscapes and scenarios, but without sort of the social license, all that great technology was just going to sit on our computers. And I think collaboratives or interacting with the publics, as John said, might be is definitely a way to kind of make progress. And from a landscape perspective, changing things, I know there's talk about, let's take Meg would like it if we took the whole Willamette National Forest and turns it into an experimental forest. That's kind of a high bar to leap over. And I think we might want to try something a little smaller and maybe areas where there's less controversy. But I think it's a matter of the social capacity to deal with landscape change. And I think what we've learned is keeping it small. Maybe we can do a lot of experimentation at the stand level, or relatively more, let's put it that way. It's harder to do it as you move up to large areas, but I think the only way to do that is to kind of take baby steps and move up in that way. So that's kind of my view on where we are with landscape ecology and its applications. Thank you.
We've got time for questions for Tom.
We'll all figure it out.
My husband was giving me a hard time the other day over breakfast. He was saying, but you don't know how this is going to play out. And I'm thinking, I've lived with this man for 25 years. He's still saying this to me.
Yeah.
So what do you say when somebody says, well, you don't know how it's going to play out. How come you're going to?
Yeah. The question is, how do you answer the question of, in any kind of situation, research or management, you don't know how it's going to turn out. That's a tough one. I mean, I think it's possible that to say that, well, it's not like we don't know anything. We know something, and history can be a guide to maybe understanding how the future might be. And so if we don't know how it's going to turn out, we still have some desires for the future. And it doesn't mean that you can't maybe anticipate how things might develop in the future. So if you have some desires for the future, the question is, will that future actually materialize? What might be the things that get in the way? What might be some surprises? And so it's like anything when you're trying to anticipate some future goal and you don't quite know if you can get there, or if you don't know what the best way to get there is, that you kind of spread your risk across a couple of different strategies and try different things out. So you use the fact that you don't know exactly how it's going to happen as a basis for trying some things out so you can kind of learn what actually works. I mean, it's easier said than done. But I think there's ample evidence that from looking at how things have developed in the past, that where we thought we were going was not where we ended up, and that if we had done some different things across the landscape, it might have actually given us more flexibility than if we just put all our eggs in the same basket. So, yeah.
I'm interested in your last slide where adaptive management was put on in the column of something that we haven't done successfully. And I'm wondering, as we, look towards the proliferation of accelerated restoration projects on the landscape that are kind of happening and not yet necessarily getting all of the pieces of adaptive management in place in time, why is adaptive management on that right column, and how do we get it into the left column, something we do successfully, and can we ever actually,
Let's see.
I have both, but what do we need to do from your perspective to change that?
Yeah. Yeah, how do we move? I mean, yeah, it's a little bit of an overstatement to say that adaptive management hasn't worked, but not much. I think it comes down to expectations. There's some fairly simple things that we can do to kind of build some capacity, like just even some simple monitoring or better documentation of what's done in management settings could provide a basis for looking back to actually learning, not necessarily setting up a formal experiment where we say, okay, here's a watershed, you're going to treat it this way, and here's another watershed, you treat it that way. That, to me, is the sort of the gold standard for adaptive management, where you actually set up some different landscape experiments. But that's a pretty tough bar, and with budgets and personnel issues, I think it's going to be tough to do. But if we can even do a better job of documenting what we have done and putting it into GIS or monumenting some places on the ground, I think people can go back then and actually look at what was done. And in the implementation of sort of restoration strategies on the east side, if we can do some different, if you can't actually plan a formal experiment, if you can at least plan across implementing a range of densities or patterns or just something to give us some variability, that would be quite valuable. So yeah, I think we often talk about adaptive management as if we need this big formal system with all kinds of feedbacks to decision makers and monitoring, and that would be great, but I think there's some maybe small ball kind of adaptive management that can be done. Yeah.
I want to put you on the spot a little bit. You had shown your scenarios you'd model out under current management. And there's winners and losers, obviously. So assuming we have no control over what happens on private lands, do you have any recommendations for how federal management should change, or what we should be looking at to make it so more of those species on that list are winners?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, yeah, the multi-ownership landscape. I know when we approached, Norm and I approached some of the private industrial owners in the Coast Range and said, look at this scenario we've done. If you just left a few more trees in your clear cuts, it would be great benefit for bluebirds and for, other species. And they said, that's not our job, that's the job of the National Forest to do that. And so there's a political dimension to that that's really tough. And so, yeah, given that if there's different burdens out there on the part of different landowners, and if the feds are really sort of taking on the mantle of biodiversity, then that would argue for the feds trying to figure out a way to kind of fill the gaps on the public lands, or maybe identify some private landowners, usually smaller ones, who are willing to sort of try some different things. But I think at this point, I think it has to be kind of more a burden that the federal land or public land managers try to pick up.
One more question, Meg?
Yeah, Meg?
Well, I'm going to pose a question to you through a statement, and that's that I think the Northwest Forest Plan originally said adaptive management is going to happen here in these adaptive management areas.
Right,
And they actually had an allocation for that.
right,
Doesn't seem to have worked very well.
Right.
To put that in one particular part of the landscape and say, well,
Right.
we're going to be adaptive here and not
Right.
everywhere else.
right.
So the thesis that I operate under is we could do it in small places, large places, and just be doing it across a variety of projects and size of projects, and bringing the public into that conversation. Right, wrong?
No, I think that's, I mean, the rationale, one of the rationales for doing it the way we did it in the Northwest Forest Plan was that everything that went, every allocation of the Northwest Forest Plan had to pass a viability analysis. And so we felt like if we were going to incorporate a scenario or an option 9 with adaptive management areas, those people those who were evaluating those options and passing judgment on their ecological impact had to kind of know where those sort of experimental areas were. So the idea is if we could get them into the Northwest Forest Plan evaluation process, then we would kind of get them vetted in a way that's saying, okay, if we're looking at the risk across the whole landscape, here's some places where we're going to do some experimenting, but fold that into the risk assessment. So that was the attempt. They didn't work out very well, I completely agree. And I think a more ad hoc approach to adaptive management is the way to go. Small things, try to do small things, try to do some, try to push up some big things wherever you can. It's going to have to be a much more free form kind of adaptive management, kind of like what's the Olympics where they do all those kind of crazy things that
Okay. help me thank Tom, everybody. I always say adaptive management is an attitude, it's not a place. That seems to work.